What is dispersion? The definition of dispersion is, it is a measure of variation of the item. It means measure of dispersion helps to describe the variability in the data. It is a statistical term that can be used to describe the extent to which data is scattered. The measure of dispersion can certain type of measures that are used to quantify the dispersion of the data. So the dispersion is a measure of the variation of the item from central value. The measure of dispersion is important to compare uniformity, consistency and reliability among variable series. In other words, dispersion is the extent to which value is a distribution differ from the average of the distribution. It gives us an idea about the extent to which individual item vary from another and from the central value. So according to the scientists people, the degree to which numerical data tends to spread about an average value is called the variation or dispersion of the data. What are the objectives of the measure of dispersion? First is comparative study. Means measure of dispersion gives a single value indicating the degree of consistency or uniformity of distribution. The single value helps us in making comparison of various distribution. The smaller the magnitude of the dispersion, higher is the consistency or uniformity, and vice versa. It means the larger the magnitude of dispersion, lesser is the consistency or uniformity. So it is very useful to compare this data. Comparability. Next is reliability of an average. A small value of dispersion means low variation between observation and average. It means that the average is a good representative of observation and very reliable. A higher value of dispersion means greater deviation among the observation. In this case, the average is not a good representative and it cannot be considered reliable. So reliability is more in dispersion. Next is control the variability. Different measure of dispersion provide us data of variability from different angles, and this knowledge can prove helpful in controlling the variation. And especially in the financial analysis of business and medicine, these measures of dispersion can prove very useful. Next is basis for further statistical analysis. Measure of dispersion provide the basis of further statistical analysis like computing, correlation, regression, testing of hypotheses, etc. Next is characteristic of dispersion. It should be easy to calculate and simple to understand. It means if it is not easily understandable, then its use will be limited. And it should not involve complex calculations. It should be based on all observation of the series. means it should take each and every item of the observations into consideration, so that if any of the item is dropped, then the dispersion should also change. Next is, it should be rigidly defined. It means it have one and only one interpretation meaning, thereby that different people compute the dispersion from the same figures, they all get the same answer. So it should not be affected by the personal prejudices and biasness of the investigator. Next is, it should not be affected by extreme values. It means it should not be affected by the presence of one or two very small or very large observations. It should not be unduly affected by sampling fluctuations. It means by sampling stability, we mean that if we take different sample of the same size from a large population and compute the dispersion of each sample, we expect to get the same answer with approximately. So there can be slight difference in the values of different sample. So this is this difference called sampling fluctuation. Next is, it should be capable of further mathematical treatment and statistical analysis. It means it should be capable of further mathematical and statistical computation to expand its utility. Next is measure of dispersion. There are two types of measure of dispersion. One is the absolute and another is the relative. Absolute dispersion is expressed in the same units in which data is expressed. For example, rupees, kg, liter, kilometer, etc. And relative is in the form of ratio or percentage, so is independent of units. It is also called coefficient of dispersion. Difference between absolute and relative measure of dispersion. Absolute measure of dispersion is the measure of dispersion which are expressed in terms of original units of data count as absolute measure. Means these are those measure of variation or dispersion which are expressed in the same statistical unit which the original data are given, such as rupees, kilograms, tons, pounds, etc. So for example, range and interquartile range are absolute measure of dispersion. Relative measure of dispersion are also known as coefficient of dispersion and are obtained as ratio or percentage. So these are pure numbers and independent of the units of measurement and used to compare two or more set of data values. It means these are the ratio of a measure of absolute dispersion to an appropriate average. It is a pure number and it has no units of measurement. Now, the methods of measuring dispersion. First is absolute measure. It consists of 5 methods: range, variance, standard deviation, mean deviation, quartile deviation. And in relative measure, it consists of coefficient of range, coefficient of variation, coefficient of mean deviation, and coefficient of quartile deviation. So one by one I will explain it. Range. It is a given data set. The range can be defined as the difference between the maximum value and the minimum value, or we can say that difference between the largest item and smallest item. It is basically used in quality control, stock exchange, which gives an idea about the change of price of gold, weather forecasting. In news we often hear minimum and maximum day temperature at various places daily. In day-to-day life, for example, while purchasing garment, we generally ask a shopkeeper about the maximum and minimum price of the garment. Next is variance. The average square deviation from the mean of the given data set is known as a variance. This measure of dispersion checks the spread of the data about the mean. It means we are checking the spreading of the data about the mean. How is it far from the mean? Next is standard deviation. The square root of the variance gives the standard deviation. Thus, the standard deviation also measures the variation of the data about the mean. A smaller standard deviation means high degree of stability or uniformity of the observation as well as the homogeneity of the series. Next is a mean deviation. Mean deviation gives the average of the data, absolute deviation about the central point. And this central point could be the mean, median or mode. It is also called average deviation. It is the mean of the deviation of the item from median or mean or mode, which ignoring the signs. Next is quartile deviation. It can be defined as half of the difference between the third quartile and the first quartile in a given data set. It is also called interquartile range, which is the difference between Q3 minus Q1, or semi-interquartile range Q3 minus Q1 upon 2, where Q3 is the third quartile and Q1 is the first quartile. It is basically used in open-end distribution because this formula is based on the median. It is a positional average also. It is not affected by extreme observation and is therefore used in badly skewed distribution like median. Next is explanation of relative measure of dispersion. First is coefficient of range. It is the ratio of the difference between the highest and lowest value in a data set to the sum of the highest and the lowest value. Next is coefficient of variation. It is the ratio of the standard deviation to the mean of the data set, and it is expressed in the form of a percentage. It was given by Carl Pearson. In such problem, it is used in such problems where we want to compare the variability of two or more series. The series for which coefficient of variation is greater is said to be more variable, or conversely less stable, less uniform, less consistent and less homogeneous. And its formula is standard deviation upon mean into 100. Next is coefficient of mean deviation. Can be defined as the ratio of mean deviation to the value of the central point. It may be mean, median, mode, which it is calculated. It is used by National Bureau of Economic Research to forecast business cycle, and it is less affected by value of extreme observations. Next is coefficient of quartile deviation. It is a ratio of difference between the third quartile and the first quartile to the sum of the third and first quartile, means Q3 minus Q1 upon Q3 plus Q1. It is not capable of further algebraic treatment, and it is subjected to fluctuation in sampling coefficient of quartile deviation. But it is used in open-end distribution because it is a positional average which depends on the median. It is not affected by extreme observations and is therefore used in badly skewed distribution. So it is useful in badly skewed distribution. Next is the summary. Measure of dispersion are used to determine the spread of the data. They are measured about a central value. Second is measure of dispersion can be classified into two types. One is the absolute and relative measure of dispersion. Another is. Next is absolute measure of deviation have the same unit as the data, and relative measures are unitless. Absolute measure of dispersion methods are range, variance, standard deviation, quartile deviation, mean deviation. These all are absolute measure of deviation. And coefficient of dispersion are relative measure of deviation, in which coefficient of quartile deviation, coefficient of range, coefficient of mean deviation, coefficient of standard deviation, or we can say that coefficient of variation. All these methods consist of coefficient of dispersion. So this is all. Thank you. Next is which measure of dispersion is to be used. So following things are to be kept in mind while deciding an appropriate measure of dispersion. First is the type of data available. If the observations are few in number or contain extreme values, that is small or a very large values, then the standard deviation is not recommended. If the distribution is generally skewed, avoid mean deviation and standard deviation both. In case of the open-end distribution, quartile deviation is recommended. Next is the purpose of investigation. Standard deviation is the most popular measure of dispersion in statistical analysis. It is capable of further algebraic treatment. However, range, quartile deviation and mean deviation which is simple and easy to calculate, and an elementary treatment of statistical series in which measure of variation is desired only for itself. For example, range is used in quality control, weather forecasting, in stock exchange, etc. Thank you.